The winter of 1867 was brutal in Copper Ridge, Montana territory, but nothing could have prepared the townspeople for what they'd find that February morning, and certainly nothing could have prepared them for what would return to their doorstep 16 years later, when that abandoned native baby came back with 500 warriors riding behind. Martha Sullivan was hanging laundry behind her small cabin when she heard the cry. At first she thought it might be a wounded animal, but as she followed the sound toward the edge of town, her heart nearly stopped. There, wrapped in a torn buffalo hide and placed carefully against the general store's back wall, was an infant. His dark hair and copper skin told her immediately what the townspeople would think, what they would demand. The baby couldn't have been more than a few days old, his tiny fists waving in the frigid air as his cries grew weaker. Martha looked around frantically. The town was just beginning to stir, and she knew that within minutes someone would discover what she'd found. More importantly, she knew what they'd want to do about it. Martha Sullivan had lost 3 children of her own to fever and accident over the years. Her husband Thomas had been taken by consumption the previous spring, leaving her alone in a town that barely tolerated her Irish accent and Catholic faith. She was already an outsider. But as she looked down at this helpless fear awakened in her, she scooped up the baby and hurried back to her cabin, her mind racing. The infant was cold but alive, his dark eyes wide and alert. She had goat's milk, blankets, important love. But Martha knew the challenges ahead would test every ounce of determination. Within hours, word had spread through Copper Ridge. Mayor Hutchins arrived at her door before noon, flanked by several prominent townsmen, including the banker, the sheriff, and the preacher. Mrs. Sullivan, Mayor Hutchins began, removing his hat with exaggerated politeness, "We understand you've taken in that child that was left by the store. His name is Samuel," she'd only just decided on. "And yes, I've taken him in." "Ma'am, you can't possibly mean to keep that Indian baby," Sheriff Dan. "It ain't natural. It ain't safe." The preacher stepped forward, his voice dripping with false compassion. "Sister Sullivan, surely you understand the Lord's plan doesn't include mixing the races in such a way. This child belongs with his own kind. And where exactly would that be?" Martha's voice carried an edge that made the men shift uncomfortably. "He was abandoned, gentlemen, left to perish in the cold. If God has a plan, perhaps it's that he should live." The standoff continued for an hour, with various townspeople gathering outside her cabin. Some shouted suggestions about what should be done with the child, most of them involving the word rid in one form or another. But Martha held firm, and eventually the crowd dispersed. They couldn't legally force her to give up the child, though they made it clear her life in Copper Ridge would become considerably more difficult. They were true to their word. Over the following months, Martha found herself increasingly isolated. The general store owner would serve her, but only after all other customers had been helped. The bank made her transactions deliberately complicated. Children were forbidden from playing near her property. The few friends she'd had gradually stopped visiting, but little Samuel thrived. He was a healthy, happy baby who grew into a curious with bright, intelligent eye. Martha taught him to speak English, but she also encouraged him to be proud of his heritage, even though she knew little about it herself. The real trouble began when Samuel turned 5 and Martha attempted to enroll him in the town school. "Absolutely not," declared the schoolmarm, Miss Henderson, her face flushed with indignation. "I will not have that savage disrupting the education of proper children." "He's not a savage," Martha, her patience wearing thin after years of such comments. "He's a bright, well-behaved little boy who deserves an education. That child belongs on a reservation, not in a civilized classroom." The argument escalated until half the town was involved. A formal town meeting was called, and Martha found herself defending not just Samuel's right to education, but his very right to exist in their community. "This has gone on long enough," Mayor Hutchins, the packed room. "Mrs. Sullivan, you've had 5 years to come to your senses. It's time to send that boy where he belongs." Martha stood up, holding Samuel's small hand. The boy looked around at all the angry faces with confusion growing. "Gentlemen, ladies," Martha began, her voice steadied, "you speak of civilization and propriety, but I see no civilization in abandoning a helpless infant. I see no propriety in denying a child education because of the color of his skin. If this is your idea of Christian behavior, then I want no part of it." The room erupted in angry shouts. Someone called for a vote to force Martha to leave town entirely, but before it could be taken, young Samuel stepped forward. "Why do you hate me?" he asked in his clear, innocent voice. "I never did anything bad to you." The room fell silent. For a moment some faces showed shame, replaced by the hardened resolve of who'd convinced themselves they were in the right. The vote was by a margin of 3-1. The town demanded that Martha either send Samuel away or leave Copper Ridge. Martha looked around at the she'd lived among for nearly very well. "But you should know that this boy will remember what you've done today, and someday he'll have the power to respond to it." Her words sent an uncomfortable murmur through the crowd, but most dismissed it as the desperate threat of a defeated woman. That night Martha made a difficult. She couldn't leave. It was all and she needed the work but she also couldn't bear to see Samuel face such hatred every day. Through her limited connection with traveling merchants, Martha had learned of the Crow village about 50. She'd heard that the Crow had a tradition of taking in children from other tribes. It broke her heart, but she believed Samuel would be better off learning about his heritage and growing up where he was wanted. The journey to the Crow village was treacherous for a woman and child traveling alone, but Martha was determined. When they finally arrived, exhausted and travel-worn, they were met with curiosity rather than hostility. The village chief, a dignified man named Running Bear, listened carefully as Martha explained the situation to a trader who spoke both languages. "You would give up this child you've raised as your own?" Running Bear asked. "Only because I love him," tears streaming down her. "He deserves to know who he is and where he comes from. He deserves to grow up without hatred." Running Bear studied Samuel, who stood quietly holding Martha's hand. The boy's eyes were alert and intelligent, and there was something about his bearing that caught the attention. "This child has the look of the Lakota about him," Running Bear observed. "The cheekbones, the set of his eyes. If he is Lakota, he belongs with his own people, not even with us." Martha's heart sank, but Running Bear wasn't. "However," he continued, "there is a Lakota band that winters in the valley beyond the northern ridge. Their chief, Spotted Hawk, is known to be wise and fair. If you truly wish what's best for this boy, perhaps we should take him." And so, after another day's journey, Martha found herself standing before Spotted Hawk's teepee. The Lakota chief was younger than Running, with intelligent eyes and an air of quiet authority. When Samuel was brought before him, Spotted Hawk's reaction immediate, startling. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, then switched to broken English. "This boy, where did you find him?" Martha explained the circumstances, and Spotted Hawk's expression grew increasingly grave. "You have raised him well. I can see strength in him and kindness. But there is something else." He paused, studying Samuel's face intently. "This child carries the marks of the sacred bloodline. His grandfather may have been Chief Thunder Horse, who fell in battle with the Bluecoats many winters ago." Martha didn't fully understand the implication, but she could see that Samuel's arrival had caused quite a stir among the Lakota. "If this is true," Spotted Hawk continued, "then this boy is not just any child. He carries the blood of great leaders. He will need to learn our ways, our language, our tradition. But more than that, he will need to learn who he truly is." The parting between Martha and Samuel was heartbreaking. The boy, now understanding that he would be staying with clung to the only mother he'd ever known. "I'll come back for you," he whispered in her ear. "When I'm big enough, I'll come back. Be strong, my brave boy, Martha. Learn everything they teach you, and never forget." As Martha rode away from the Lakota camp, she carried with her the image of Samuel standing proudly beside Spotted Hawk, ready to begin a new chapter. His promise would come back. Years passed in Copper Ridge, with no word of the. Martha continued her quiet life, working as a seamstress and keeping. The townspeople gradually stopped talking about the Indian boy, assuming he'd been absorbed into tribal life, forgotten about his time among them. They couldn't have been more wrong. Samuel, who had taken the Lakota name Lone Wolf That Returns, proved to be everything Spotted Hawk had suspected, and more. The boy had an extraordinary capacity for learning. He mastered the Lakota language within months, absorbed their spiritual traditions, and showed remarkable skill in hunting, riding, and warfare. But more than his abilities, it was his character that set him apart. Lone Wolf possessed a natural leadership quality that drew other young warriors to him. He was brave without being reckless, thoughtful without being indecisive, and he had an unusual ability to see beyond immediate problems to larger solutions. As he grew, stories of his heritage became clearer. Spotted Hawk's investigations revealed that Samuel was indeed of the legendary Chief Thunder Horse, whose death had scattered his band years earlier. Many of Thunder Horse's former warriors were still alive, scattered among various Lakota bands. When word spread that his grandson had been found and was growing into a strong leader, many began to speak of reunification. But Lone Wolf never forgot his other life. He never forgot Martha Sullivan's kindness, and he never forgot the cruel treatment he'd received from the townspeople of Copper Ridge. As he grew older and stronger, a plan began to form in his mind. He would return to Copper, but not as the helpless child driven away. He would return as a leader of his people, with enough strength behind him, respect. By his 16th birthday, Lone Wolf had become a respected warrior with followers from multiple Lakota bands. Warriors who had served under his grandfather came to pledge their loyalty to Thunder Horse's grandson. Young braves from other tribes came to test their skills and ended up staying to learn from him. When Lone Wolf announced his intention to return to the white settlement where he'd been raised, over 500 warriors volunteered to ride with him. The journey south toward Copper Ridge took 2 weeks, with the massive war party moving carefully to avoid detection. Lone Wolf had made it clear that this was not a raid or an attack. It was a homecoming, but he also wanted the full impact of his arrival to be unmistakable. Meanwhile, in Copper Ridge, life had settled in predictable pattern. The town had grown somewhat over the years, with new families arriving and businesses expanding. Most of the people who remembered the Indian Boy incident still lived there. They rarely spoke of it. Martha Sullivan, now in her 50s, continued her quiet existence. She often thought of Samuel and wondered what had become of him. Sometimes she imagined seeing him again, but she'd never dared hope it would actually happen. On a warm morning in late summer, young Billy Henderson was playing near the edge of town when he saw something that made his blood run cold. Riders were approaching from the north. Not just a few riders, but what looked like an entire army of mounted warriors stretching across the horizon. Billy ran, screaming into town, and within minutes, church bells were ringing the men grabbed rifles and took positions behind buildings and wagons. Women gathered children and headed the strongest structures in town. Sheriff Daniels, now graying but still in charge, tried to organize some kind of defense, but he knew they were outnumbered. The war party approached slowly, deliberately, with a single rider up front. They stopped just outside rifle range and remained motionless, an intimidating display of discipline and strength. Then the lead rider began to approach alone. As he drew closer, the townspeople could see he was young, probably still a teenager, but he carried himself with the authority of a seasoned chief. He was magnificently dressed in traditional war regalia, with eagle feathers in his long black hair and paint on his face. He rode a powerful, spotted horse with complete confidence. The young warrior stopped in the middle of the main street and looked around at the terrified faces peering out from doorways and windows. His gaze lingered on the general store where he'd been found as an infant, then moved to the school where he'd been rejected, then to the church where the townspeople had voted to drive him away. Finally, his eyes found what they were looking. Martha Sullivan had emerged from her cabin and was walking slowly toward him, tears streaming down her face. "Samuel!" she called out, her voice barely audible. The young chief dismounted and removed his war bonnet, revealing the face she remembered, but transformed by years and experience. "Hello, Ma," in perfect English. The town held its collective breath as Martha and the young man embraced in the middle of the street. Many of the onlookers remembered the little boy who had been driven away 11 years earlier, but none could reconcile that memory with the powerful young leader who now stood before them. "I told you I'd come back," Lone Wolf said softly. "You certainly did," Martha replied, pulling back to look at him. "And it appears you didn't come alone." Lone Wolf smiled, the same warm smile she remembered from his childhood. "I brought some friends. I thought it was time Copper Ridge met the other side." Mayor Hutchins, considerably older and grayer than when Samuel had left, slowly approached with several other town leaders. His hands shook as he tried to project authority he clearly didn't feel. What do you want?" Lone Wolf studied the mayor for a long moment before answering. "Justice." The words sent a chill through. Many remembered Martha's warning from years earlier that the boy would someday have the power to respond to their treatment. "Justice," Lone Wolf repeated, his voice carrying clearly across the silent street. "For the way you treated an innocent child, for the way you treated the woman who showed him kindness, for the hatred you showed when you should have shown compassion." Sheriff Daniels stepped forward, his hand on his gun. "Now see here, boy." "Chief," Lone Wolf corrected firmly. "Chief Lone Wolf that returns war leader of the Thunder Horse Band of the Lakota Nation, and I suggest you remove your hand from that weapon, Sheriff. My warriors have very good eyes and very quick reflexes. Indeed, the townspeople could see that dozens of rifles were now trained on them from the mounted warriors surrounding the town. What kind of justice are you talking about, Mayor Hutchins, his voice barely steady? Lone Wolf was quiet for a long moment, seeming to consider his answer carefully. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. When I was a child, he began, you taught me that the color of my skin made me less than human. You taught me that mercy was weakness, and that might made right. You taught me that the strong could drive away the weak without consequence. He paused, letting his words sink in. Well, I learned those lessons very well. Today, I am the strong one. Today, I have 500 warriors behind me, and you have perhaps 50 men with old rifles. Today, I could drive you from this place just as you drove me. I could take everything you have, just as you tried to take everything. The townspeople exchanged terrified glances. Many were silently calculating their chances of survival if 500 warriors decided to take revenge. But, Lone Wolf continued, and that single word contained all the hope anyone in Copper Ridge had left, I also had another teacher, a woman who showed me that strength could be gentle, that power could be merciful, and that love was stronger than hate. He gestured toward Martha, who stood proudly beside him. Martha Sullivan taught me that true civilization isn't about the color of your skin or the language you speak. It's about how you treat those who are helpless. It's about standing up for what's right even when it costs you everything. Lone Wolf walked to the center of the street and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the town. So, here is my justice, people of Copper Ridge. I will not drive you from your homes as you tried to drive me from mine. I will not separate families as you tried to separate me from the only mother I knew. I will not teach your children to hate based on the color of their skin. The relief in the crowd was palpable, but Lone Wolf wasn't finished. However, things will change. From this day forward, any native person who comes to this town will be treated with the same respect you show each other. Your school will accept children regardless of their heritage. Your businesses will serve all customers fairly, scanning the faces. And if I hear that you've returned to your old ways, if I learn that you've mistreated any person because of their race or heritage, then I will return. And next time, I might not be feeling. Mayor Hutchins nodded. Yes, of course, that's very good. Then his stern expression. There's one more thing. I'd like to spend some time with my adoptive mother. The town has none at all, several people called out quickly. Lone Wolf turned to his warriors and spoke in Lakota. The war party began to organize itself into a proper camp just outside town, close enough to keep an eye on things but far enough away to avoid making the townspeople more nervous than necessary. Over the next 3 days, something remarkable happened in Copper Ridge. The initial terror gave way to curiosity, and curiosity gradually became genuine interest. Some of the braver townspeople ventured out to the Lakota camp, where they were received with polite caution. Lone Wolf spent most of his time with Martha, sharing stories of his life among the Lakota and listening to her tales of what had happened in Copper Ridge during his absence. But he also walked through the town, visiting the places that held memories from his childhood. At the school, he had a long conversation with who was now the head teacher. She was older and perhaps somewhat wiser than when she'd refused to accept him as a student. I was wrong, she admitted, unable to meet his eyes. I was afraid and ignorant, and I let that override my duty as an educator. Fear makes people do things they later regret. The question is what we do with our regrets. Do we let them eat at us, or do we use them to become better people? I'd like to become a better person. Then teach all children well, regardless of who they are or where they come from. That's how you honor the child you once turned away. At the general store, the owner, Mr. Peterson, made a point of showing Lone Wolf the exact spot where he'd been found as an infant. I always wondered what became of him. I have to admit, I never imagined this. Life rarely turns out the way we expect, Lone Wolf, but sometimes it turns out better than we dared hope. Even Sheriff Daniels sought him out. The old lawman looked haggard and tired. I spent a lot of years telling myself we did the right thing, Daniels said. But looking at you now, seeing the man you become, I can't help but think this town missed out on something special. Every person has potential, Sheriff. The tragedy isn't what this town missed out on. The tragedy is how many other children never got the chance to show what they could become. On his final morning in Copper Ridge, Lone Wolf gathered the townspeople in the main street. Many of the same faces that had voted to drive him away 16 years earlier were now looking at him with a mixture of respect and residual fear. "I want to leave you with a thought," he began. 11 years ago, you saw a native child and assumed he was your enemy. You were wrong, but your mistake taught me something valuable about the power of assumption." He gestured toward his warriors, who sat quietly on their horses behind him. "These men rode here with me, not because they hate you, because they trust me. They trust that I would not lead them into something dishonorable. That trust was earned through years of proving myself worthy of as many people. Trust, respect, and honor are not given based color of skin or the language. They are earned through our action, choices, and our character. I hope that in the years to come, this town will remember that lesson." Mayor Hutchins stepped forward with a formal proclamation. "Chief Lone Wolf, on behalf of the town of Copper Ridge, I want to present you with this official apology for the treatment you received as a child, and this declaration that you will always be welcome here." Lone Wolf accepted the document with dignity, though everyone could see he was more moved by the gesture than he was letting on. "Thank you," he said simply, "but the real test of this apology won't be in the words written on paper. It will be in how you treat the next person who needs help, the next child who's different, the next stranger who comes to your town seeking acceptance." As the war party prepared to leave, Martha walked beside Lone Wolf's horse for as long as she could. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "Nothing could keep me away for long," he assured her. "You're my mother, and this will always be one of my homes, but I have responsibilities to my people now." "I'm so proud of you," Martha said, tears flowing freely. "Not just because of what you've accomplished, but because of who you've chosen to become." "I had a good teacher," Lone Wolf replied. "You showed me that love is stronger than hate, that mercy is more powerful than revenge. Those lessons have served me well." As the Lakota war party rode north, the people of Copper Ridge watched until they disappeared over the. Many were left wondering a strange turn their. The abandoned native baby they'd rejected had returned as promised, but not as the enemy they'd feared. Instead, he'd come back as a teacher, showing them that their assumptions about strength, weakness, civilization, and savagery had been backwards all along. In the weeks and months that followed, Copper Ridge slowly began to change. When the next native family passed through town, they were served respectfully at the general store and invited to camp peacefully nearby. When a mixed-race child needed schooling, Miss Henderson personally ensured he was welcomed in her classroom. The transformation wasn't instant or complete. Some people held on to their old prejudices, and change came slowly. But gradually, Copper Ridge became known as a place where people of all backgrounds could find fair treatment. Martha Sullivan lived to see her town become something she could be proud of. She kept in touch with Samuel through occasional messages carried by friendly traders, and, true to his word, he visited every few years. On one such visit, when Martha was in her 70s and Samuel had become a renowned leader among not just the Lakota, but many other tribes, she asked him if he ever regretted the difficult path his life had taken. Regret? Lone Wolf considered the question carefully. "How can I regret a journey that brought me to exactly where I needed to be? How can I regret experiences that taught me who I truly am?" He looked around at the bustling, more tolerant town that Copper Ridge had become. "Sometimes the hardest lessons, most valuable ones. You taught me love and mercy. This town taught me strength and determination. My people taught me honor and tradition. I needed all of those lessons to become the man I was meant to be." Martha smiled, understanding that the frightened little boy she'd found in the snow had grown into exactly the leader his people needed, strong enough to fight when necessary, wise enough to show mercy when possible, and confident enough in his own worth. He passed the hatred of others to the possibilities for something better. The story of the abandoned native baby who returned with 500 warriors became legend throughout the territory, but those who lived it knew that the real miracle wasn't in the dramatic return or the display of power. The real miracle was in the choice that Lone Wolf made when he had all the power, the choice to break the cycle of hatred and fear, to respond to cruelty with wisdom, and to use his strength not for revenge, but for justice. It was a lesson that Martha Sullivan had planted in the heart of a scared little boy, and it had grown into something that changed not just a town, but all the lives it touched for generations to come. Years later, when Martha was laid to Copper Ridge Cemetery, representatives from dozens of native tribes came to pay their respects to the white woman who had raised one of their greatest leaders. Lone Wolf spoke at her funeral, telling the gathered crowd that she had taught him the most important lesson of his life, that family isn't about blood or race or tradition, but about love, sacrifice, and the choice to see the best in others even when they can't see it in themselves. The headstone that marked Martha Sullivan's grave bore a simple inscription, "Beloved mother, faithful friend, teacher of mercy." But those who knew the full story understood something more. She was the woman whose kindness to an abandoned child had prevented a war and created a legacy that would last long after all of them were gone. And in the Lakota camps, the story was told differently, but with the same respect. They spoke of the white woman who had saved Thunder Horse's grandson, not just from death, but from hatred, raising him with such love and wisdom that when he finally had the power to destroy his enemies, he chose instead to transform them. Both versions of the story carried the same truth, that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change the course of history, and that true strength lies not in the ability to defeat others, but in the courage to help them become better than they are.